Kestrel's hand shot up before his mind could stop it, bidding $50 on a woman whose eyes held the fury of a caged wildcat. The auctioneer's gavel hadn't even fallen when another voice cut through the dusty Montana air like a blade through. Silk. 200. The stranger in the black suit stepped forward from the shadows of the general store, his pale fingers drumming against a silver-tipped cane. Kestrel's blood turned to ice water. He'd seen that man before. Vex Morgan, the railway baron who collected beautiful things the way other men collected debts. $250, Kestrel called out, his voice rougher than sandpaper. Every coin he'd saved from 3 years of cattle drives sat heavy in his pocket, but it might as well have been pebbles against Morgan's bottomless coffers. The widow Lirale was her name, he'd learned from the courthouse papers, stood motionless on the auction platform. Her midnight hair whipped around her face in the prairie wind, but she didn't flinch when Morgan's cold gray eyes assessed her like livestock. That defiance in her green stare made Kestrel's chest tighten with something he'd never felt before. 500, Morgan drawled, not even bothering to look at Kestrel. And I'll throw in an extra 50 for the auctioneer's trouble, the crowd murmured. $500 could buy a man a decent ranch, not just a widow with debts. Kestrel's hand trembled on his hat brim. He had exactly $237 to his name. Every penny earned breaking wild horses and driving ornery cattle across unforgiving terrain. Going once, the auctioneer called, his eyes already calculating his commission. Lirale's gaze found Kestrel's across the dusty square. For a heartbeat, something electric passed between them. Recognition, maybe, or desperation. She'd been watching him too, he realized. During the 3 days since her husband's debts had landed her on the auction block, she'd noticed the tall cowboy who lingered at the edges of the crowd, his weathered hands clenched into fists whenever men spoke of her like chattel. Going twice, wait. Lirale's voice rang clear as a church bell. I invoke widow's right of appeal. The auctioneer's jaw dropped. Morgan's pale face flushed red. Ancient law hadn't been used in Montana territory for over a decade, but it was still legally binding. A widow could demand proof that her highest bidder could provide for her properly, not just financially, but morally. I call for trial by fire, she continued, her chin lifting with regal authority. Let both men prove their worth through deed, not just coin. Kestrel's heart hammered against his ribs. Trial by fire meant competition usually involving physical challenges, tests of character, or both. It was dangerous, unpredictable, and exactly the kind of thing that could get a man killed if his opponent played dirty. Morgan's laugh was sharp as breaking glass. How delightfully primitive? Very well, my dear. What did you have in mind? Lirale stepped down from the platform, moving with the fluid grace of a dancer, despite the simple brown dress that marked her as property to be sold. She walked straight to Kestrel, close enough that he could smell the lavender soap in her hair and see the small scar above her left eyebrow. 7 days, she said, her voice low enough that only he could hear. 7 trials. Whoever wins the most challenges wins my hand and my debts. And if I lose, Kestrel whispered back. Her smile was sharp enough to cut steel. Then pray Morgan kills you quickly because I won't survive long in his collection. The weight of her words settled over him like a lead blanket. He'd heard the stories about Morgan's estate, the locked rooms, the servants who disappeared, the wives who married him and were never seen in public again. I accept, Kestrel said loudly, his voice carrying across the square. Morgan's smile was all teeth and no warmth. Excellent. Let the games begin. Dawn painted the sky blood red when Lirale announced the first trial, breaking the devils. Mustang, a black stallion that had killed 2 men and crippled a third. The horse stood 16 hands high with eyes like burning coals, his coat gleaming with sweat and fury in the morning light. Morgan arrived at the makeshift arena dressed like he was attending the opera, complete with polished boots that had never touched honest dirt. He surveyed the Mustang with the detached interest of a man examining a particularly challenging chess problem. I trust you don't expect me to risk my neck on that beast personally, he said, adjusting his silk gloves. I've brought a professional. The professional turned out to be Brutus Kane, a horsebreaker from Colorado whose reputation preceded him like the smell of death. Cain was built like a brick wall, with hands the size of dinner plates and scars crisscrossing his arms were angry. Horses had tried to take their revenge. "My champion against yours," Morgan continued smoothly. "Surely that's fair?" Kestrel's jaw tightened. He'd been expecting dirty tricks, but not this soon. "I don't have a champion. I fight my own battles." Refreshingly honest. Morgan's smile never wavered. "Cain, show our cowboy friend how it's done." The crowd pressed closer as Cain entered the corral. The devil's Mustang reared, hooves flashing like steel blades, but Cain moved with surprising grace for such a big man. He had a rope in his hands, and murder in his eyes. What happened next made Kestrel's blood run cold. Cain didn't try to gentle the horse or earn its trust. Instead, he used the rope like a weapon, lashing the stallion's flanks until it bled, driving it against the fence posts with calculated cruelty. The Mustang screamed an almost human sound of pain and rage, but Cain kept advancing. "Stop," Lorelei whispered, her face pale as winter snow. But Cain didn't stop. He cornered the exhausted horse and threw his weight onto its back. The stallion bucked wildly, desperately, but its strength was already broken by the brutal beating. Within minutes, the once proud Mustang stood trembling and defeated, its spirit crushed under Cain's merciless hands. "Broken," Cain announced, sliding off the horse's back. Next, the crowd cheered, but Kestrel heard the sickness in their voices. This wasn't horsemanship, it was torture dressed up as skill. "Your turn, cowboy," Morgan called out, though I fear our friend Cain has rather set the bar high. Kestrel climbed over the fence rails, his heart pounding. The devil's Mustang watched him approach with eyes full of pain and broken trust. Blood trickled from the welts on its flanks, and its proud head hung low with exhaustion. "Easy, boy," Kestrel murmured, extending his hand palm up. "I'm not here to hurt you." The stallion flinched away, expecting more violence. Kestrel settled cross-legged in the dirt, just out of kicking range, and began to hum an old Apache song his grandmother had taught him about healing wounded spirits. Minutes passed. The crowd grew restless, but Kestrel remained motionless, humming softly. Gradually, the Mustang's ears pricked forward. Its nostrils flared, scenting the air around this strange man who offered no rope, no whip, no violence. "What's he doing?" someone called out. "Wasting time," Morgan replied, but his voice had lost its confidence. Kestrel slowly stood and took a step closer. The Mustang tensed but didn't bolt. Another step, another finally. Kestrel stood close enough to touch the horse's muzzle. His hand moved with infinite gentleness, stroking the velvet nose, whispering words of comfort and respect. When he swung onto the stallion's back, there was no bucking, no screaming. The devil's Mustang stood proud and steady, its spirit unbroken. Despite Cain's cruelty, together they moved around the corral in perfect harmony, not master and slave, but partners united by mutual trust. The crowd fell silent. Even Morrigan's smug expression faltered. Lorelei stepped forward, tears streaming down her face. "The first trial goes to Kestrel Nightwind." But as she spoke the words, Kestrel saw something that chilled him to the bone. Morrigan wasn't angry at losing. He was smiling, as if everything was going exactly according to plan. The second trial came at midnight, announced by Lorelei, with a voice steady as granite despite the tremor in her hands. "Test of courage in the face of death," she declared. "Whoever can retrieve the golden eagle feather from Widow's Peak wins." A widow's peak thrust up from the prairie like a stone dagger, its sheer cliff face gleaming silver in the moonlight. Local Crow elders whispered that spirits of betrayed women guarded the summit, their ghostly wails carried on every wind. More practically, the peak was home to a nest of golden eagles whose talons could shred a man's face in seconds. Kestrel studied the rock face, calculating handholds and the best route up. Beside him, Morgan adjusted his leather climbing gloves. With the casual confidence of a man who'd scaled mountains for sport in the Swiss Alps. "After you, cowboy," Morgan said with mock courtesy. "Unless you'd prefer to concede now and save us both the tedium." "Ladies first," Kestrel replied, gesturing toward the cliff. Morgan's laugh was sharp as breaking bottles. How droll. But I suppose peasant humor has its charm. They began climbing together, finding different routes up the treacherous rock face. Morgan moved with practiced efficiency, his expensive equipment glinting in the pale light. Kestrel climbed with the fluid grace of someone who'd grown up scrambling over canyon walls, using only his hands and the worn leather of his boots for grip. 50 feet up, Morgan made his first move. Small avalanche of stones tumbled past Kestrel's head to precisely aim to be accidental. Kestrel pressed himself against the cliff face as razor-sharp fragments whistled by his ear. Careful, friend, Morgan called down. These old rocks can be quite unstable. 100 feet higher, Kestrel heard the distinctive whistle of steel through air. He threw himself sideways just as a climbing spike supposedly dropped by accidento bedded itself in the rock where his head had been moments before. Terribly clumsy of me. Morgan's voice drifted down, but Kestrel could hear the frustration beneath the false politeness. They climbed in deadly silence after that. Each man focused on reaching the summit first. The eagle's nest sat in a depression. At the peak's highest point, guarded by two magnificent birds whose eyes gleamed like molten gold in the moonlight. The male eagle was easily 4 feet from wingtip to wingtip, its hooked beak designed for ripping flesh from bone. Morgan reached the nest first, but the eagles immediately attacked with savage fury. He swung his ice axe wildly, trying to drive them back, but the female eagle raked her talons across his cheek, drawing 3 parallel lines of blood. Damned birds. Morgan snarled, pulling a small pistol from his coat. The gunshot cracked like thunder across the silent peak. The male eagle tumbled from the sky, its magnificent wings folded in death. The female screamed her grief and rage, but Morgan had already snatched the golden feather from the nest. Victory, he announced, holding the prize aloft. But as he turned to begin his descent, Kestrel emerged from the shadows on the far side of the peak. In his hands, he held not 1 golden feather, but 3 plucked, not from the nest, but freely given by the eagles themselves. How Morgan's face went white with shock. Kestrel had approached the nest from the opposite side, moving with the patience of a hunter who understood that predators recognized kinship. He'd offered the eagles strips of jerky from his pack, spoken to them in the old tongue his Apache grandmother had taught him, and waited until the female eagle herself had shed 3 feathers in acknowledgement of his respect. The trial wasn't about taking, Kestrel said quietly. It was about earning. The female eagle perched on his shoulder as he began his descent, her yellow eyes fixed on Morgan with unmistakable hatred. At the base of the cliff, Lirelei waited with tears in her eyes, not for joy at Kestrel's victory, but for sorrow at the unnecessary death of the magnificent male eagle. The second trial goes to Kestrel, she announced. But know this, both of you. Every life taken in these trials weighs on my soul. Morgan's expression had turned predatory. Then perhaps we should make the remaining trials more permanent. In nature, blood soaked into the sawdust of Murphy's saloon as the third trial reached its brutal climax. What had started as a contest of marksmanship had devolved into something far darker when Morgan's champion proved to be Razzle Cross, the fastest gun in 3 territories and a man who'd never lost a duel because he'd never let an opponent live long enough to tell about it. The rules had seemed simple enough. Hit 5 targets at increasing distances, using period firearms. But when Cross stepped into the saloon's back room with his twin Colt, 45 South gleaming like death itself, the nature of the trial changed. I propose we make this interesting, Cross drawled, his pale eyes never leaving Kestrel's face. Real targets. Real consequences. 5 men sat bound to chairs at various distances claim. Jumpers and horse thieves who'd been awaiting trial in the local jail. Morgan had somehow arranged for their temporary release into his custody. Shoot the playing cards pinned to their chests, Cross explained with a smile that belonged in a graveyard. Missed the card. Hit the man. That's just unfortunate. Marksmanship, isn't it? Lerelei's face had gone chalk-white. This wasn't the trial I agreed to. Trials evolve, my dear, Morgan replied smoothly. Surely your brave cowboy isn't afraid of a little pressure? The bound men were conscious, terror bright in their eyes as they stared at the playing cards pinned over their hearts. The nearest sat only 10 feet away. Easy shot. The farthest was a full 50 yards through the saloon's open back door. Barely visible in the lamplight, Cross drew first, his movements fluid as quicksilver. 5 shots rang out in rapid succession, each bullet splitting its target card perfectly down the middle. Not one prisoner was harmed, though the man at 30 yards had fainted from pure terror. "Your turn, cowboy," Cross said, already reloading with practiced ease. "Unless you'd prefer to forfeit." Kestrel drew his worn Remington revolver, a gun that had belonged to his father and his father's father before that. It wasn't fancy, but it had never failed him when life hung in the balance. The first shot was easy. The card at 10 feet disintegrated, leaving the prisoner untouched but shaking like a leaf in a hurricane. The second target required more concentration. 20 feet, with the prisoner twisting slightly in his bonds. Kestrel breathed slowly, feeling his heartbeat steady and squeezed. The trigger. The card exploded into confetti. By the 4th shot, sweat beaded on his forehead despite the cool evening air. 40 feet was a difficult shot with any gun, but with men's lives hanging in the balance, it felt impossible. He aimed carefully, accounting for the slight tremor in the prisoner's hands, and fired.
Well.
The card disappeared. The final shot was nearly impossible. 50 yards in dim lamplight, with the prisoner barely visible as a shadow against shadows, Cross leaned against the bar, his confidence absolute. No one could make that shot under these conditions. Kestrel holstered his gun. "What are you doing?" Cross demanded. Instead of answering, Kestrel walked the full 50 yards to the final prisoner. The man was probably in his 20s, with desperate eyes and hands that shook with more than just fear. "What's your name, son?" Kestrel asked gently. "J. Joshua," the young man stammered. "Joshua Pike. What did you do to end up here, Joshua?" "Stole a horse. But it was to get medicine for my baby sister. She's got the fever, and that's enough," Kestrel said quietly. He unpinned the playing card from Joshua's chest, tore it in half with his bare hands, and let the pieces flutter to the ground. "The trial is about marksmanship," he announced, turning back to face Cross and Morgan. "Not about terrorizing bound men. I refuse to participate in torture." The silence stretched taut as a bowstring. Then Lirelay stepped forward, her voice clear and strong. "Kestrel wins the 3rd trial through moral courage. Sometimes the greatest marksmanship is knowing when not to shoot." Cross's hand dropped to his gun, but Kestrel was already moving, his own weapon clearing leather with lightning speed. For a heartbeat, death hung in the air between them. Then Morgan laughed. "Stand down, Cross. We'll settle this properly. Later." The promise in his voice was darker than midnight. The 4th trial took place in the old silver mine outside town, where shadows crawled like living things, and the air tasted of copper and fear. Lirelay's voice echoed off the tunnel walls as she announced the challenge, a test of wisdom in the face of temptation. Navigate the maze and choose correctly when offered 3 doors. The mine's labyrinthine passages had claimed dozens of lives. Over the years, miners spoke in whispers of men who'd entered the depths and emerged days later, babbling about voices in the darkness and choices that damned the soul. Local Shoshone elders avoided the place entirely, claiming it sat atop a spirit crossroads where the living world touched something far older, more dangerous. Morgan descended into the darkness carrying an expensive miner's lamp that cast dancing shadows on the tunnel walls. "How charmingly atmospheric," he commented, though his usual confidence seemed strained in the subterranean gloom. Rather like Dante's version of a carnival funhouse, Kestrel followed with only a simple torch, its flame flickering in the stale air that moved through the tunnels like the breath of some sleeping giant. He'd been in mines before, dangerous, unstable places where a man's life hung by the thread of his own caution and the mercy of forces beyond his control. The maze was more treacherous than either man had expected. Passages branched and twisted, leading to dead ends that opened into hidden chambers or sheer drops that plunged into echoing darkness. More than once, Kestrel heard the distant sound of Morrigan cursing as he encountered another false path. After what felt like hours of navigating the underground labyrinth, both men emerged into a circular chamber where 3 doors stood carved into the living rock. Each door bore an inscription in multiple languages, English, Spanish, and symbols that looked far older than either. The first door proclaimed, "Wealth beyond measure," the second declared, "Power over life and death," the third whispered. Knowledge of all secrets between the doors sat a figure that made both men step back in shock. An elderly Shoshone woman, her face lined with age and wisdom, her dark eyes reflecting depths that seemed to contain lifetimes of experience. She wore traditional clothing that somehow remained pristine despite the mind's dust and decay. "Choose," she said simply, her voice carrying the weight of judgment itself. Morgan stepped forward without hesitation, his pale eyes fixed on the second door. "Power over life and death," he announced. "With such authority, I could reshape this entire territory to my will." The door opened at his touch, revealing a chamber filled with golden light and the sound of distant screaming. Morrigan stepped through without looking back, and the door sealed itself behind him with the finality of a tomb closing. Kestrel approached more carefully, studying the ancient woman's face for some hint of guidance. Her expression remained neutral, but something in her eyes suggested approval of his caution. "The doors offer everything a man might desire," he said slowly. "But desire and need aren't the same thing." "Speak your choice," the woman replied. Kestrel looked at each door again, thinking of Lirelay waiting above ground, of the trials yet to come, of the life he hoped to build if he survived Morgan's games. Wealth would make things easier, but he'd lived poor before. Power was seductive, but he'd seen what it did to men like Morgan. Knowledge was perhaps the most dangerous temptation of all. The promise of understanding everything, controlling everything, becoming something more than human. "I choose none of them," he said finally. "I choose to walk back the way I came and accept what life gives me through honest work and earned love." The elderly woman smiled for the first time, and in that smile Kestrel saw approval older than the mountains themselves. The 3 doors faded like mist, revealing a simple passage that led back toward the surface. "Wisdom," she said, "the rarest treasure in any mine." As Kestrel emerged into daylight, he found Lirelay waiting with tears in her eyes. Of Morrigan there was no sign, only a faint echo of laughter that might have been wind through the mine. Shafts, or something far more sinister. "Where is he?" Lirelay asked, getting exactly what he asked for. Kestrel replied grimly. Morgan returned at dawn, his expensive clothes torn and his pale face bearing scratches that looked suspiciously like claw marks. His silver-tipped cane now bore strange symbols that seemed to shift and writhe when viewed directly, and his gray eyes held a light that belonged to no human gaze. "Fascinating experience," he said, though his smile was sharp enough to cut glass. "Quite educational. I trust you enjoyed your little moral victory, Cowboy." The 5th trial was to be a test of healing, Lirelay announced with visible reluctance. A fever had swept through the local Crow village, claiming 3 children and leaving, a dozen more teetering between life and death. Whoever could save the most lives would win the trial. "How perfectly dramatic," Morgan commented, adjusting his torn sleeves. "Though I fear you'll find my methods rather more effective than conventional medicine." He produced a leather satchel from his coat, its contents clinking with the sound of glass vials and metal instruments. "Modern chemistry, my dear. Far superior to whatever folk remedies our cowboy friend might employ." Kestrel said nothing, but his weathered hands checked the contents of his own packherbs his Apache grandmother had taught him to recognize. Roots gathered under specific moon phases, and knowledge passed down through generations of healers who understood that illness often had causes beyond the purely physical. The Crow village sat in a valley between 2 hills, its tipis arranged in a circle that had been broken by tragedy. The sick children lay in the medicine lodge, their small bodies burning with fever, while their families maintained vigil with prayers and tears. Spotted Hawk, the village elder, greeted both men with wary respect. "You come to heal," he said in heavily accented English. But healing requires understanding. These children carry sickness that white man's medicine cannot touch. Morrigan dismissed the elder's words with imperial arrogance. Primitive superstition. Fever is fever, regardless of its origin. He immediately began treating the children with his modern medicines: quinine for the fever, laudanum for the pain, arsenic compounds that he claimed would purify their blood. His methods were aggressive, forceful, designed to attack the symptoms with chemical warfare. Kestrel took a different approach. He sat with each child individually, learning their names, listening to their families describe not just the physical symptoms, but the dreams that accompanied their illness. Dreams of dark spirits and cold places that felt older than memory. Working alongside Spotted Hawk and the village medicine woman, White Dove, Kestrel prepared treatments that addressed both body and spirit. Willow bark tea for the fever, but also sage smoke to cleanse negative energies. Echinacea root to boost their immune systems. Combined with traditional songs that called their spirits back from whatever dark places they'd wandered. Mumbo jumbo. Morgan scoffed, but his confidence wavered as two of the children under his care took dramatic turns for the worse. His chemicals were fighting the fever, but something else was fighting back, something his medicines couldn't touch. By evening, the difference was stark. The children Kestrel had treated were sleeping peacefully, their fevers broken, and their breathing steady. The two under Morrigan's care lay in delirium, their small hands clawing at invisible threats, while they whispered words in a language that predated human speech. "Impossible," Morgan snarled, his composure finally cracking. "My methods are scientifically proven. Your methods treat symptoms." White Dove interrupted, her voice carrying quiet authority. "But these children suffer from something your science cannot measure. Their spirits were touched by darkness, and only light can heal such wounds." As if responding to her words, the two children under Morrigan's care suddenly sat up in unison. Their eyes had gone completely black, and when they spoke, their voices carried harmonics that made every adult in the lodge step back in alarm. "The games must continue," they said in perfect unison. 7 trials were promised. 7 trials shall be completed. Then they collapsed back onto their blankets, their eyes returning to normal as their fevers finally broke. But the message was clear, whatever force was orchestrating. These trials wasn't finished with either man. Liralay's voice shook as she announced the results. "The 5th trial goes to Kestrel. But something tells me the real contest is just beginning." Storm clouds gathered despite the clear sky moments before. The 7th trial came without announcement. Manifesting like a fever dream as reality itself seemed to bend around Liralay's final declaration, a test of sacrifice. Each man must choose what he values most, then surrender it to prove his worthiness. The setting was no longer the familiar Montana prairie, but a twilight realm that existed between worlds, where the ground was made of crystallized starlight and the sky bled colors that had no names. Morrigan stood at one end of the ethereal space, his form wreathed in shadows that moved independently of his body. Whatever he'd gained in that mine shaft had transformed him into something that wore his face but was no longer entirely human. "Delightfully metaphysical," he said, his voice echoing with harmonics that hurt to hear. "Do so enjoy trials that reveal the true nature of things." Kestrel faced him across the impossible landscape, his weathered hands steady despite the surreal circumstances. Between them stood Liralay, but not as she had been. Her form flickered between her human appearance and something far more ancient, a figure of judgment with eyes that held the wisdom of ages and power that could reshape reality with a thought. "The trial has already begun," she said, her voice carrying the weight of cosmic authority. Rogan chose power over life and death. In claiming it, he sacrificed his humanity. Now he must prove whether that sacrifice was worthwhile. Around Morrigan, the shadows solidified into the forms of everyone he'd ever destroyed in his climb to power. Wives who'd died under mysterious circumstances. Business partners who'd disappeared after crossing him. Workers who'd perished in his unsafe mines and railways. They stood in silent accusation, their eyes reflecting the price of his ambitions. "I regret nothing," Morrigan declared, but his voice cracked slightly. "Power, requires sacrifice. Weak men cannot understand the weight of necessary choices. Then demonstrate your power, Lirelei commanded. Save one of them. Prove that your sacrifice has given you the ability to undo death itself. Morrigan raised his hands, dark energy crackling between his fingers.
Oh.
But as he reached toward the ghostly forms, they began to fade. The power he'd claimed came with a cost. It could only take life, never restore it. His desperate attempts to resurrect even one of his victims failed utterly, leaving him surrounded by empty air and the echoes of his own hollow laughter. I chose wrong, he whispered, the admission torn from his soul like a physical wound. Kestrel stepped forward, his own choice clear in his heart. I sacrifice my fear, he said simply. My fear of not being enough, of not having enough, of losing what matters most. I choose to trust that love given freely will return in its own time and way. The words carried power that made the crystalline ground ring like a bell. As Kestrel spoke them, he felt years of doubt and insecurity fall away like shed skin. The poverty of his youth, the loneliness of the trail, the desperate need to prove himself worthy, all of it dissolved in the face of a deeper truth. Love wasn't about deserving. It was about choosing to give without expecting return. Lirelei's form solidified back into her human appearance, but her eyes still held depths that spoke of cosmic awareness. In sacrificing your fear, you've gained what Morrigan's power could. Never provide the strength to love without reservation. Morrigan's scream of rage shook the Twilight Realm as he was pulled into whatever darkness he'd embraced in the mine. His final words echoed across dimensions. This isn't over. But as reality reasserted itself around them, returning them to the Montana prairie under a dawn sky painted gold and rose, Kestrel knew it was over.
A1.
Not through strength or cleverness, but through the willingness to become vulnerable in service of something greater than himself. Lirelei stepped into his arms, no longer a prize to be won, but a partner choosing her own destiny. So, she said with a smile that could have lit the darkness itself, what do we do now? Kestrel kissed her softly, tasting freedom and possibility and the promise of tomorrow. We build something worth the winning. Behind them, the devils. Mustang nickered softly, as if agreeing that some victories were worth any price.